Okay, apes people. So back by popular demand, you can thank Libby. She asked me if I would do a couple videos like I had done last year for AP Bio. So the biochemical cycles work that you guys did was really great. In other words, these bio slash geochemical cycles that we're talking about are carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus. Carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, and the water cycle, along with watersheds. So if we take a quick peek at this, I'll give you a few examples here. So um, there are a number of ways that these things move kind of through the atmosphere. So these are all, you're going to realize too, all of these elements are going to be part of like biological systems. So like carbon, hydrogen, oxygen make up, and nitrogen make up basically our DNA, RNA, proteins, carbohydrates, you name it. All of these things are components of that system. So for the most part, all of these things that you see here, in this case, carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, sulfur, hydrogen, or water, in this case, are all gaseous cycles. I mean, they have a gaseous phase to it. The only one that does not is phosphorus. Phosphorus is sedimentary only, so it's like leached out of rocks. We'll get into that a little bit as we go. So obviously these nutrients are, chomps. Sometimes you've heard that, or chops in NS. You've heard probably this a million times in your different biology classes. So I think the big thing is to look at some of where these are factors. A lot of the first ones, sulfur is one you probably wouldn't think much of. It's found in proteins and DNA. Nitrogen is a limiting nutrient in plants and in marine systems. Nitrogen's hard to come by. There's tons of it in the air around us, but there are very very few organisms that can pull it out of the atmosphere and actually use it as a component in their bodies. So when we're talking about carbon always is the big thing with carbon. There's a few pieces to it. This one you probably know the best, which is respiration. So it's when there's food that we eat, we breathe in oxygen, we breathe out CO2 and water. Respiration happens in all living things. I can't stress that enough. Plants, animals, bacteria to some extent, but all living things have to go through respiration. They have to turn some type of food source, whether they make it themselves or not, into energy. The other one that you know pretty well is photosynthesis. Obviously, we take CO2 and water that's in the atmosphere. CO2 is absorbed from the atmosphere as a gas. Water can be taken in as a liquid form from the roots. And we get glucose and oxygen, which are then excreted into the atmosphere. The oxygen, at least anyway. Glucose ends up as a solid somewhere that's then used for respiration. Another type of synthesis, which is once again synthesis to make, is chemosynthesis. This happens in places where there's limited light. So for example, the bottom of the ocean, around sulfur vents, around volcanoes, where it's a little too warm for plants to live, you can have what's called chemosynthesis. They take, instead of using light, this HV here, I'm assuming is their symbol for light, they're using this, instead of using light as the catalyst to make it happen, what's happening is it uses sulfur. And the sulfur actually then drives this reaction, and instead of getting ironically, you get two things. You get rid of CO2 out of the atmosphere like you do in photosynthesis. There's a consumption of water. The CO2 and the water combine to make carbohydrates. And then instead of being released as oxygen, it's released as the sulfur compound with four oxygens. So this then becomes that rotten egg smell that you would smell like around places like thermal vents and so on and so forth like that. But in either case, you're getting CO2 removed from the atmosphere, the use of water, production of carbohydrates, and then some type of oxygen derivative produced. And then the last piece that you don't talk about is things like where this stuff can live. So ironically, the atmosphere, CO2 only remains for up to 3 years. So any major changes in the Earth's composition, like so, if we obviously started driving less and using less carbon dioxide, or producing less carbon dioxide from cars and what have you, transportation, you name it, um, greenhouse gases go down significantly. All right, so it doesn't stay in the atmosphere long. Ironically, through the whole COVID thing, there was this, or at least the first part of COVID anyway, from March to let's say May, there was a massive reduction in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere because people were staying home. Just it's amazing to see. So it would take a very short period of time to reverse a lot of the effects of global warming. However, the question is, can you maintain that? But it's a whole other story. Obviously, it stays in the soils for about 25 to 30 years, and at the bottom of the ocean, marine sediments is where it stays the longest. Right? Think about all the phytoplankton or photosynthetic algae that live inside the top 10 feet of the ocean's water layers. They're absorbing carbon dioxide. They're producing oxygen. They're getting eaten by things, and those things are eaten by other things, and so on and so forth. And then, obviously, when they die, they land at the bottom of the ocean. Were there some anthropogenic effects or man-made causes? Obviously, combustion of fossil fuels. So we take some type of fossil fuel, burn it, and we get CO2 and water. Okay. Sinks and sources. So a source of carbon dioxide is humans breathing. A source of carbon dioxide is burning fossil fuels. A sink is where it's stored. When we look at deforestation, one of the issues with that is that we remove a sink of carbon, and we take that source of carbon and we release it back into the atmosphere. They use this thing called slash and burn agriculture, which we'll talk a little bit later on. New versus old carbon. Keep in mind that there's carbon that has been sequestered or stored in places, in sinks for millions and millions of years. We'll think of something like fossil fuels that are dug out of the ground, whether it's coal, oil, peat moss, those kind of things. Anything that we would use to generate heat, electricity, propulsion in vehicles is old carbon, right? New carbon is stuff that's made, staying in the atmosphere relatively consistently. So, for example, the fact that maybe I'll have some corn tonight for dinner, and that corn was carbon that was in the plant, was in the air first. The plant absorbed it, produced seeds, which are the corn kernels. I eat those kernels. I chew, get the sugars out of them, and then I breathe out CO2. That would be new carbon. A little bit of a freeze here. There we go. Okay, so here's an example from the 1960s through 2010 of the amount of carbon dioxide that has been found in the atmosphere in Hawaii. So they must have measuring stations all around the world. This is one from Hawaii. They show this annual cycle of like how it goes up, how it goes down. That's what these red lines here are. So the peaks would be somewhere around April, middle of the summer, which is where the most CO2 is because you're coming out of the winter. Here we start to have plants become available, plants that would absorb that CO2 until the point where the plants in, like, say, the northern hemisphere, for example, which was where most of that vegetation that does that is, and there's most of our landmass in the northern hemisphere, as plants in the northern hemisphere are actually absorbing CO2 out of the atmosphere, the levels go down and they drop below that average over a course of time. But then what happens is all those plants die off in the wintertime and up it goes again, and so you get this natural like ebb and flow, or breathing in or breathing out of the earth, if you think of it that way. So it's here we're breathing out carbon dioxide, here we're breathing it in. Here we breathe out carbon dioxide, breathe it in. So this is the earth actually in its biological life breathing in and out, which is pretty cool. We talked about some of the ways carbon can get into the atmosphere. Obviously, there's atmospheric carbon. Carbon can be trapped in the ocean, can be actually as CO2 within the ocean. Obviously, fish breathe out carbon dioxide, which stays dissolved in the water. Much of the gases that come out of the ocean tend to be oxygen, not carbon dioxide. It can be stored in trees for long periods of time. And this diagram is just kind of giving you some, I hate to say imaginary numbers, but they're just kind of talking about where it is and how it gets there. So you see 60 units of CO2 coming out here. There's always, so much, in the environment that's in the atmosphere that's staying there. We have more. We have 90 leaving the ocean with 92 staying in. We have it moving from the surface to the just subsurface in the ocean. We have it, getting deposited at the bottom of the ocean. We can measure all these numbers, and the idea would be is that we could account for all of the carbon. Not something we're going to do here, but you kind of get the picture, I think. So the nitrogen cycle, ironically, this is the toughest one. it's one of the most limiting nutrients in most environments, and it's because there are very, very few organisms that can actually remove nitrogen gas, which is N2, from the atmosphere. So you get really 78% of our atmosphere is actually nitrogen gas, and of that 78%, we can't use any of it. Animals can't use any of it. Plants can't use any of it. The only organisms that can use it are these tiny little bacteria. So we have cyanobacteria and these rhizobacteria. And these rhizobacteria are small little nodules or little nuggets, if you will, found on the roots of legumes. For those who don't know what legumes are, they're plants that make pods. So soybeans, peas, beans, things like that. These bacteria have a symbiotic or like a mutual relationship with the plants. And what happens is they get a place to live on the roots of plants, and then they take the atmospheric nitrogen and turn it into something that plants can use. So they actually take it from gaseous nitrogen and turn it into a liquid or a hard chemical that can be absorbed by plants. In this case, ammonia, NH3. Once again, it's abiotic, meaning that this is what is found in non-living systems. It would be nitrogen dioxide, N2O, or HNO3. Both would be non-organic forms of this nitrogen that can be there. But these then can be absorbed into plants, and then plants can then take these and add these. They can what they call assimilate it inside themselves. So imagine you're a bean plant. And you're doing bean plant things, you're growing all that kind of stuff. You get your leaves out, you're collecting sun, you're pulling water from your roots, you're getting CO2 from the atmosphere, and as you're producing the things that you need to make, in this case, we'll use really plants. Their whole goal is to produce seeds. Well, in the pods, like in a bean pod or a pea pod or a lima bean pod, whatever it happens to be that you're looking at, those seeds are super high in protein. And the reason they're high in protein is because the nitrogen that was in the atmosphere gets absorbed, is taken in by these bacteria. The bacteria turn into a form of nitrogen, in this case NH3, or either of these others that can be absorbed by plants. That then gets assimilated into the plants, into their roots. They make DNA, they make proteins, they make amino acids. All right. Then animals can then take this nitrogen from the plants, so herbivores would then take this and then reassemble it into their own amino acids and their own DNA. Right? When we as humans either eat the plants or eat the animals, that's our source of nitrogen. Okay. Nitrification, and we'll go through this a little bit more, but nitrification is when you take one form of nitrogen, turn it into either NH3 or NH2, or NH4 for that matter, which would be another one, or NO2, which is nitric oxide, or NO3, once again nitric oxide. So think of it this way: nitrogen, first of all, it has to be fixed. So you have to take it from the atmosphere, put it into a chemical to be used by plants. Okay, that's called nitrogen fixation and nitrification. Then once that nitrogen is in a form that can be absorbed, the plants absorb it and they produce amino acids, DNA, and so on and so forth. The next thing that's going to happen is that we, as animals, one of the things we do is we eat, things with nitrogen in it, and we pee and we poop. The odor, sometimes the ammonia odor, noticed found in your urine, is actually nitrogen waste. We know that if you've ever had a garden before, that animal waste makes a good fertilizer. Why? It's high in nitrogen. So instead of the plants having to get the nitrogen from the bacteria, we can use this fertilizer, if you will, dead debris. Right? We can use other plants as fertilizer for other plants because now the nitrogen is trapped inside. When that nitrogen is removed, all right, that nitrogen ends up back into the soil in a form, in the case like NH3, NH2, that can be reabsorbed by plants. Occasionally, not occasionally, a lot of times, there's this denitrification that takes place. So now that, let's say, nitrogen from the atmosphere is breathed in by these small little bacteria, it's made into a form that the plants can uptake. The plants uptake it, they assimilate it as part of their body. All right. We then eat those things as herbivores or carnivores. All right, we then go through the process where we break down the foods that we eat and we release a nitrogen or compound that's in the form of ammonia, NH3, NH4, NH2. Right, that waste, the human waste or the animal waste or the plant waste, then eventually it could be decomposed by bacteria. Those decomposing bacteria, they denitrify it, and they take that and they put that nitrogen back into the atmosphere in the form of either N2 or nitrous oxide. Keep jumping ahead here. Human impacts. So combustion of fuel. So NO2, NO3, NO4 is found when you burn certain types of fuel. More so things like diesel fuel, coal, things like that will actually produce this nitric oxide, NO2, NO3, NO4, one of those components. That's why it's an X, it's a variable. And we get what's called photochemical smog or smog. You don't see it as much around here. You see it more kind of out in the western part of the country. It has to do with climate a little bit. And we also can get acid rain. So, for example, if you're living in Detroit and there are factories in Detroit that are burning things and producing nitric oxides, you'll get smog or poor air quality. In that, what's going to happen is in the atmosphere that this nitrogen then breaks down and it breaks down in the clouds, and it lowers the pH of the rain. And it won't really rain in Detroit. It's going to rain a few states over. It might rain even as far as as Massachusetts. If you watch the weather map, our weather moves from west to east across the northern hemisphere. Some other things that we can do is we can use fertilizers. So if you fertilize your grass or fertilize your garden, I'll use your grass in particular. Maybe you have the Scott's lawn guy come and they spray all kinds of chemicals on your grass, make it nice and green and healthy and what have you. They sometimes spray too much. Well, oftentimes spray too much. And when it rains, instead of just staying on your property, it might bleed into your neighbor's property a little bit. So let's say my grass is nice and green because I have the Camelon people come and my neighbor whose yard touches mine. You can actually see the difference between where mine's green and where his isn't. But over the times it rains, the chemicals will run off into his yard and actually make his yard greener. It has its pros and cons. One of the things that can happen is this fertilizer can run off and cause what's called eutrophication. So eutrophication has to do with, you see it a lot in the spring. Forge Pond in East Bridgewater is a great example. You'll get large amounts of nitrogen that ends up in Forge Pond, which is right next to Mary Lou's. And what will happen is there's tons of nitrogen, so the algae grow like crazy. And so you get this green scum across the top, which seems great because algae is going to be food for somebody, and it's going to make oxygen, and it's going to take CO2 out of the water and CO2 out of the atmosphere. However, the algae dies. And once the algae dies, there's really nothing to eat them except bacteria. So bacteria will start eating the algae. As they eat the algae, the bacteria don't make oxygen, so they use oxygen. And as they're eating the algae, they lower the DO, which is dissolved oxygen in the pond. So the algae actually strip the oxygen out of. The bacteria strip the oxygen out of the pond, which doesn't leave enough oxygen for fish, and we get fish death. Planting insects. One of the ways we can, there are some things that we can do here. For example, like runoff from manure. We talked like the first or second day of the school year about pig farms down south, and how they have these feedlots where they bring the pigs in and they just keep feeding them all day long, or cows and they feed them all day long, and they basically get them fat so they can bring them to slaughter. One of the things that happens there in these feedlots, you get large amounts of manure. So if it rains, it's going to go somewhere, runs off into rivers, streams, people's yards, so on and so forth. The other thing is planting excessive nitrogen-fixing crops. So if you plant crops like soybeans, for example, and you put soybeans in the same plot of land year after year after year, you can actually get too much nitrogen in that soil, which could then cause that to then run off somewhere else as well too. So you want to rotate your crops. Nitrogen cycle is crazy. Big thing to remember is there are these bacteria that live on the roots. Their job is to absorb nitrogen from the atmosphere. You can see where it goes from the atmosphere into these little things on the roots. All right. They then produce ammonia or ammonium, which can either be used by the plant itself or it can be absorbed into the roots of other plants. Okay. So sometimes they'll do co-plantings where they'll plant beans or potted type plants next to plants that don't have beans or pods. And the idea is that you can then have one plant. Well, this plant here, maybe it's not going to be used for a commercial use, but its only job might be to add more nutrients to the soil to a plant that may have a better use. So from there, one of the things that can happen is the plant can be eaten by somebody, right? Maybe it's one of these little guys here. Don't know why they're not showing you somebody eating the plant, but it could be eaten by the plant, or eaten by something like the herbivore you see or eating right there. So we're going to go from in the atmosphere into the plant into some type of ammonium, NH2, 3, 4 that can be absorbed by plants. Microbes in the soil can use it, all these kind of things. Sometimes it can, um, stay in the soil and not actually go anywhere. You might, from there, you're going to get, let's see here, a lot going on here. You're going to get the plants, once again, that eat the things that have fixed the nitrogen, so in this case, plants. Then their waste will become more ammonia. All right, this guy could eat the rabbit. Once again, his waste becomes more ammonia. Finally, what's going to happen is there's going to be bacteria at some point that's going to cause denitrification, meaning that these bacteria will take the nitrogen compounds and break them into smaller pieces and release it back into the atmosphere as either NO2, nitric oxide, or nitrogen gas. All right. Increase in nitrogen use due to anthropogenic sources. You can see where we use this. So a couple places. Fossil fuels, notice, are pretty small. Nitrogen fixing agroecosystems, which are man-made systems where we try to fix nitrogen into the soil. Industrial fertilizer use. So in large-scale operations that grow hundreds and hundreds, thousands of acres worth of food, they do use industrial fertilizers, meaning that they have these massive tankers. They look like big gas tanks, and they tow them behind the tractor. And inside, instead of gas, it's nitrogen, and they pump nitrogen into the ground as a way of fertilizing the ground. And obviously, total human input. These are all the things that we do to increase this on an annual basis. So this is all these guys together. Sulfur cycle. Sulfur cycle is very, very similar to nitrogen cycle in some respects, in the sense that it's stored in places. It's not something we can pull out directly or we can't use directly. It's a gaseous cycle. It's stored in rocks. As rocks break down over the course of time, it can be released as sulfur gas. Volcanoes spew out sulfur dioxide or hydrogen sulfide, which is H2SO4. Dimethyl sulfide from the ocean. Sulfur, once again, can release from the ocean. Sometimes that's that low tide rotten egg smell. Human impacts, combustion of coal is the big one. So anytime you plug in any electric device, good chance of it actually coming from coal, meaning that the electricity that powers that object is going to come from coal. So when you burn coal, you release sulfur monoxide, dioxide, trioxide into the atmosphere, which forms H2SO4, which is an acid or sulfuric acid, or hydrogen sulfide, another way to put it, and contributes to the formation of acid rain. Smelting. Smelting is when they take metal and they heat metal up to make it molten and then pour it into molds. Once again, in East Bridgewater, if you're heading north towards Whitman, on the left-hand side, right across from Goodyear, there is a smelting plant there. It's a D.W. Clark, I think is the name of it. I think it's in the process of closing now, but they actually make like manhole covers, and they make big metal objects that are all cast from smelting. So they take iron ore or some type of metal, they heat it up, and when you heat that ore up, part of the process releases sulfur dioxide. Come on. I don't know if I'm at the last slide. I might be. No, I didn't think so. Okay. So once again, some just kind of sulfur cycle. The majority of our sulfur is coming from burning of fossil fuels. Some of it from volcanic activity. But you got to realize, if you look at this chart here, 100 units out of this whole thing are all coming from the breakdown of fossil fuels. So phosphorus is the only non-gaseous cycle. So phosphorus is found in sedimentary rock, and what happens is this over the course of time as rocks weather, whether it be through chemical, meaning it gets rained on and it leaches out, it oozes out, or physical, like the breaking of rocks due to like heating and cooling. All of these things are going to release phosphorus into the environment. We can physically mine phosphorus as well. It is the limiting nutrient in most freshwater systems. So phosphorus you need in order to make DNA and RNA. So if you don't have a source of phosphorus, you can't rebuild cells, make new DNA and RNA. Ironically, once again, so this gets into imagine it starts up on top of these hills, and it's going to move as it breaks down. It's going to move down the rivers and streams into like wet and marshy areas. Fungus likes wet, marshy areas. We talked about this a little bit the other day. Keystone species. They're important in the sense that they can absorb the phosphorus from the ground out of the water and put it in as part of their body. And as those things are eaten by other systems or they decompose, then that phosphorus is released for other organisms in the area. So mosses and algae actually tend to make moss in particular actually make a pretty good soils for you turn those into your soils and those kind of things. Peat moss, for example, is one that you see that people churn into their gardens because it has a high amounts of phosphorus in there. It also is another is also found in fertilizer. So in addition to coming and having them putting nitrogen or nitrates on your grass to make your grass green, they might use phosphorus, which will cause the grass to grow taller, thicker, more cells. All right, the ability to make more DNA and split cells up, which makes it thicker, fuller, so on and so forth. The same thing here. This stuff can be washed off into places like Forge Pond, cause eutrophication, which is a quick growth followed by a death of the algae, which then are eaten by decomposers or bacteria. The bacteria then use the oxygen that's inside the pond, which then kills the fish. And another place you see phosphates, not as much anymore, but it's in detergents. So it used to be in like laundry detergent, dishwashing detergent, dishwashing soap, things like that. It was really good at helping break down stains. Right? But we've kind of gone away from that because we know it's bad for the environment, and especially if you have septic systems, you're pumping that stuff into the groundwater, and it has obviously other impacts. I believe this is the last one: hydrological cycle or water cycle. So this is driven by the sun and gravity. So if you think about like our tides, right? Our tides, so the moon's is part of this too. So the tides make the waves move side to side. Gravity also has an impact on waves as well. But the sun has a huge impact on it in the sense that the sun beats on the equator nonstop, pretty much daily at somewhere on the planet. As the sun heats the water at the equator, you get evaporation. Evaporation then is gonna go up from the equator, so it's 0 degrees north and south. It's gonna go up and it's gonna plume up, and as it plumes up, it starts to cool, and then as it cools, it's moving away from the equator in this kind of like convection, this current called a convection current, and as it moves, it's going to then start to cool, and as it cools, it falls down as precipitation. So we get places, let's say, from 0 to 30 degrees that rain a lot. Once you get further north of 30 degrees, not as much water vapor in the air. Ironically, most of our deserts across the world are right around 30 degrees, which is kind of interesting. So we have a number of different types of terms that are going to come up here. So I always find this to be fascinating that 71% of our surface is covered by water. Only 3.5% of it's fresh. And of that 3% that is fresh, only 0.02% is available for consumption, meaning that's drinkable water. So well less than 1% of the 3% is actually drinkable. What do we use that for? You shower in it. You use it in your toilet. Use it to wash your car, water your yard, all those kind of things. So we're not using different water that we drink. We're not isolating drinking water from other uses. So some of these terms. Evaporation obviously is when it gets too warm, the water then converts from water liquid to water vapor. Transpiration, this one you might not be super familiar with. This is what we could do on the grass in the morning. So this is when water is pulled up from the roots into the plants. The plants have these small little pores called stomata that open and close, and as they open and close, water is allowed to leave the plant. That's called transpiration. So it's the breathing of water out of plants. Why would plants want to breathe out water? It's because think of it as like a straw effect. So as they breathe the water out, it pulls more water up into the plant from the roots. Condensation, clouds, rain, and then precipitation is just another term for condensation. This water droplets eventually, once they condense, will precipitate as one of those types of things there. As far as what are some human impacts, obviously, dams, water diversion projects, that can be an issue. The fact that we build places that are impervious to water filtration. So, for example, parking lots, water can't flow through a parking lot because the surface is impervious to water. The more impervious surfaces we create, the more issues we have with where water goes and how water runs in different places. Clearing vegetation. We talked about the fact that deforestation can keep the water from the water holding ability of soil. It gets disrupted. So if you cut the trees down, now the soil can't hold the water because there's nothing to absorb it, and it makes the soil run off, or the water itself runs off and then floods other areas. Groundwater depletion. This is when you don't see this as a little bit here, more so in the western part of the country with the huge droughts that are happening out there now. Large portions of California are actually sinking because there are huge aquifers or underground water reservoirs out there. And these reservoirs are slowly being depleted because we're constantly sucking water out of those reservoirs, using it for things like irrigation. And most of the things that we irrigate are foods, obviously. So here's kind of a typical hydrological cycle. Obviously, you're going to get some type of evaporation from land, creates moisture. You get these currents that drive the clouds in one direction or another. When the clouds become too saturated, or when they reach 100% saturation based on the temperature, it falls as some type of precipitation. Interestingly enough, we also have water that percolates or moves through the ground. Think about like a coffee maker, right? If you take the coffee maker and you put the water in the top, and there's coffee grounds in there, you turn it on, the water drips onto the coffee grinds, right? And as it drips onto the coffee grinds get wet, and they then bleed through the coffee grinds, the water, and as that water then is collected inside of the vessel below, which is like your coffee pot, and you're actually leaching out the pigments out of the coffee. You do it with warm water because the warm water does a much better job of leaching the pigments out than does cold water. Otherwise, you'd have cold brew coffees works a little differently in that sense. But the same idea is going. There's this infiltration that takes place, or this percolation that takes place, where water is going to move through the ground. And as it moves through the ground, a couple things actually happens. Because it's running through rock and sand, it actually gets fairly clean as it runs through. So we have pretty clean water down here in the groundwater. Unfortunately, we do things like something called fracking, which is where we fracture the ground in order to get the natural gas out, which has an issue with that, but that's a whole other story. You'll also find that when you get close to the ocean surface, there'll be this mixture of salt and fresh water, sometimes called brackish water, where salt water from the ground can flow into the ocean, and salt water from the ocean can seep back into the groundwater. Human impacts, obviously, anytime we take and we build flat areas, like we take, we cut all the trees here down, it gives the opportunity for it to run off. We have parking lots that are impervious, so massive amounts of water hit these parking lots and they run off into fields and those kind of things, as opposed to just being absorbed into the ground. We can put dams in. Dams will change the flow and rate of the water. Lack of precipitation. Like recently, we haven't had a lot of snow in some areas around the country, which doesn't give us a good snowpack on top of the mountains. The snowpack on the mountains is almost like, if you think about it, it's like you're storing water for the summer, in the sense that snow lands on the mountain, it stays cold there for many months during the year, and once it gets warm, that water then has the ability to melt and run off, and then fill rivers, fill underground water supplies, and fill the oceans again. And we're having issues with that, where these things aren't happening. If you don't have snow, ironically it's a double negative in some respects. Snow actually, nice white fresh snow, actually has heat, and the heat energy actually bounces off the earth, which keeps the earth colder, which is great. The problem is when you get rid of the snow, now there's no white smooth surface. There might be a jagged dark surface, which causes more heating of the earth, which causes less snow to fall, which causes the earth to heat up even more. So some serious issues. Any questions? Yes, we'll talk about this more in class, but I hope this is a help. Keep looking. I really Can't stress enough, you really have to know the nitrogen cycle. I think the carbon and water cycles are relatively easy. Phosphorus, relatively easy. Nitrogen is going to be the big sticking point. Make sure you spend some time with that one and see what you can do with it. All right, thanks. Have a good day.